Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We appreciate you joining us as we navigate the complex corridors of the human mind and the darkness that can reside within. A relationship can be a sanctuary, a private world built for two. But what happens when the walls of that world close in, creating an echo chamber where delusion takes root? When one person's psychosis is transmitted to another, a shared, toxic reality is born. Tonight, we explore Folie à Deux, a madness for two where twisted love and shared delusion combine to form a conspiracy that ends, inevitably, in murder. Case 1. The Papin Sisters' Bloody Revolt. In the provincial city of Le Mans, France, in the year 1933, there stood a respectable bourgeois home at number 6 Rue Brière. It was the home of René Lancelin, a retired solicitor, his wife Leonie, and their adult daughter, Genevieve. Their lives were governed by the quiet, rigid order of their class and time. The house itself was a testament to this order, floors polished to a mirror shine, furniture dusted to perfection, meals served with unwavering punctuality. It was a silent, well-oiled machine of domesticity. And like any such machine of that era, it was powered by the invisible labor of servants. The servants were two sisters, Christine and Leah Papin. Christine, the elder at 27, and Leah, 21, were more than just employees. They were fixtures, almost specters, within the Lancelin home. For 7 years, they had lived and worked within its walls, their existence circumscribed by the attic room they shared and the endless cycle of chores that defined their days. They were known for their impeccable work ethic, their quiet demeanor, and their almost unnerving efficiency. They were, by all accounts, perfect maids. But this perfection was a mask. Behind their silent, obedient facade, the sisters inhabited a world of their own, a psychological space as confined and airless as their small attic room. Their bond was not merely one of sisterly affection, it was one of absolute, suffocating codependence. They had been separated for much of their difficult childhood, shuttled between orphanages and abusive relatives after their mother, convinced their father was molesting Christine, had forced them into institutional care. When they were finally reunited as young women, they clung to each other with a fierce, desperate loyalty, sealing themselves off from a world that had offered them nothing but cruelty and instability. In the Lancelin house, this isolation intensified. They spoke only to each other, often in low whispers. They took their meals alone in the kitchen. They had no friends, no social life, no existence outside the Rue Brière. Their only sanctuary was their small room at the top of the house, where they would retreat after their 16-hour workdays. There, in the darkness, the two became one. They slept in the same bed, their lives and identities merging until the boundary between Christine and Leah became porous, almost non-existent. Christine was the dominant force in this dyad. She was intelligent, proud, and possessed a simmering, volcanic temper that she kept ruthlessly suppressed. Her earlier years in a convent had instilled in her a rigid sense of morality and a deep-seated fear of sin, yet this piety was at constant war with a profound sense of injustice. She saw the world in stark terms of good and evil, purity and corruption. And in her mind, the Lancelin household, with its endless demands and its quiet, condescending authority, was a source of constant, grating humiliation. Leah, by contrast, was submissive, timid, and utterly devoted to her older sister. She was Christine's shadow, her echo. She saw the world not as it was, but through the dark filter of Christine's perceptions. Christine's resentments became Leah's resentments. Christine's paranoia became Leah's paranoia. Leah did not have thoughts of her own. She absorbed Christine's. She was the passive partner in what was becoming a textbook case of folie à deux shared madness. The source of their shared delusion was the very environment they were praised for maintaining. The meticulous standards of their employer, Madame Leonie Lancelin, were not overtly cruel, but they were relentless. Madame Lancelin was a woman obsessed with perfection. She would run a white-gloved finger over furniture to check for dust. She would inspect every corner, every dish, for the slightest imperfection. Each inspection was a silent judgment, a reinforcement of the sister's status as something less than human. To Christine, these acts were not just the demands of an employer, they were personal, psychological attacks. They were violations. The pressure built slowly, year after year, in the oppressive silence of the house. The sisters' private world grew darker. They began to believe they were being watched, persecuted. A simple request from Madame Lancelin was twisted in their shared mind into a threat. A misplaced object was evidence of a plot against them. Their resentment festered, a poison they passed back and forth between them in the confines of their attic room, amplifying its potency with each exchange. They were living in a pressure cooker, and the valve was beginning to fail. The catalyst for the explosion was a mundane, domestic object, a new electric iron. On the evening of February 2nd, 1933, something went wrong. A short circuit in the iron's wiring caused a power outage in the house. Christine knew this would not be overlooked. It was a flaw, an imperfection in their service that would surely be noticed by Madame Lancelin, who, along with her daughter Genevieve, was due back from a shopping trip at any moment. The faulty iron became the focal point of all of Christine's accumulated rage and paranoia. It was the ultimate proof of a world conspiring against them. When Madame Lancelin and Genevieve returned, they found the house dark. They ascended the stairs and were met by Christine on the landing. The confrontation that followed was, by all accounts, brief. Madame Lancelin inquired about the iron, her tone likely one of mild annoyance. But in Christine's mind, this was not an inquiry. It was an accusation. It was the final, unbearable humiliation. In that moment, something inside Christine Papin snapped. The years of suppressed rage erupted with the force of a natural disaster. She lunged at Madame Lancelin, screaming, and, according to her later confession, clawed at her eyes. Genevieve rushed to her mother's defense, and Christine turned on her as well, attacking her with the same feral intensity. Leah, standing on the landing, witnessed the beginning of the attack. Her response was instantaneous and automatic. She did not hesitate. She did not question. She joined her sister. The shared psychosis had reached its breaking point, and the two women, acting as a single entity, unleashed a storm of violence that was almost beyond comprehension. What followed was not murder in the conventional sense. It was an annihilation. They dragged the two women, who were still alive, up the stairs. The struggle was brutal. Christine yelled to Leah, "Tear her eyes out." As Christine attacked Genevieve, Leah went to the kitchen and returned with a knife and a hammer. In the dim light of the hallway, they bludgeoned, stabbed, and kicked their employers for what must have felt like an eternity. They grabbed a heavy pewter pot and used it to smash the women's heads and faces. Their rage was focused, specific, and grotesque. They mutilated the bodies, particularly the faces and legs, with a kitchen knife, slashing them to the bone. The violence was so extreme that the victims were rendered unrecognizable. Their eyes had been gouged out by hand and placed nearby on the floor. It was an act of profound, symbolic destruction, an attempt to obliterate the very gaze that they felt had persecuted them for years. When it was over, there was silence. The landing was a scene of unspeakable carnage. But the sisters' actions that followed were perhaps even more bizarre and chilling. There was no panic, no attempt to flee. Instead, they performed a strange, final ritual. They cleaned the hammer and the knife, placing them back in the kitchen. They washed their hands and faces, locked the front door from the inside, and then locked the door to the room where the bodies lay. They then went up to their attic room, took off their blood-soaked clothes, and, naked, got into their bed, huddling together in the darkness. The deed was done. Their private world had violently consumed the public one. They had restored their own twisted sense of order. Monsieur René Lancelin arrived home later that evening to find the house dark and impenetrably locked. The lights were out, save for a single, faint glow from the maid's attic room. Alarmed, he called the police. When the officers finally broke down the door, they were met with a scene of absolute horror. The bodies of Leonie and Genevieve Lancelin lay mangled on the floor, their identities almost entirely erased by the sheer brutality of the attack. The officers ascended the stairs to the maid's room. There, they found the door also locked. They broke it down and found Christine and Leah Papin in bed together, clinging to one another. When an officer asked what had happened, Christine responded with a calm, chilling clarity. "It is us," she said. They confessed immediately, not with remorse, but with a sense of justification. They calmly recounted the entire event, which they referred to as an act of defending their skins. They explained their actions as a necessary response to the perceived attack from their employers. The trial of the Papin sisters became a national sensation in France. The case tapped into the raw nerves of a society deeply divided by class. For the political left, including intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, the sisters were revolutionary figures, proletarian heroes who had risen up against their bourgeois oppressors. Their crime was seen as a tragic but inevitable consequence of class exploitation. For the right, and for much of the general public, they were simply monsters, inhuman demons whose crime defied all reason. Medical experts were brought in to assess their sanity. The diagnosis of folie à deux was central to the proceedings. It was argued that Christine, the primary partner, suffered from paranoia and had created a delusional world of persecution which she had successfully imposed upon her passive and devoted sister, Leah. They had become so enmeshed in each other's psychology that they acted as one, driven by a shared, distorted reality. Despite the diagnosis, the court was not swayed towards leniency. The sheer brutality of the crime demanded punishment. Christine Papin was sentenced to death by the guillotine, a sentence later commuted to life in prison. Leah Papin, seen as the less culpable partner, was given a sentence of 10 years of hard labor. The true test of the folie à deux diagnosis came after their sentencing, when they were separated for the first time in years. The effect was profound and immediate. Leah, removed from her sister's dominant influence, became a model prisoner. She was quiet, obedient, and her mental state visibly improved. She served 8 years of her sentence before being released, going on to live a quiet, anonymous life under a new identity, reportedly working again as a hotel maid. Christine, however, completely disintegrated. Robbed of her acolyte, her echo, her shared world collapsed. She fell into a deep depression, refusing to eat and becoming increasingly erratic. She suffered from intense psychotic episodes, at one point attempting to gouge out her own eyes, as if trying to complete the symbolic act she had started on her victims. She was eventually transferred to a mental asylum in Rennes, where she continued to deteriorate, starving herself to death in 1937. The story of the Papin sisters endures as one of the most stark and disturbing examples of shared psychosis leading to murder. It is a story about how love and devotion, when twisted by isolation and paranoia, can create a private reality more powerful than the external world. Christine and Leah Papin were trapped not only by the social structures of their time, but by the prison they built for themselves. They created a world for two, and when that world was threatened, they defended it by committing an act of violence so extreme that it continues to horrify and fascinate to this day. It serves as a chilling testament to the idea that the most dangerous madness is the one that finds a willing partner. Case 2. The Heavenly Creature's Fourth World. The city of Christchurch, New Zealand, in the early 1950s, was a place of deep-seated social conservatism. It was a city that prided itself on being more English than England, a community governed by quiet conformity, rigid class structures, and the unspoken rules of propriety. It was a world of neat gardens, hushed Sunday services, and a prevailing belief in the proper order of things. It was into this orderly world that two teenage girls from vastly different backgrounds would introduce a chaos so profound and so violent that it would leave an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. Pauline Parker was a product of the working-class suburbs. She was a stocky, brooding girl of 15, with dark eyes that held a watchful intensity. She lived in a modest, rented house with her parents and siblings. Her father managed a fish market, and her mother, Honora Riper, took in boarders to make ends meet. To Pauline, her family life was a world of suffocating mundanity. She saw her parents as simple, unimaginative people who could not possibly understand the complex, churning world of her inner life. She was an intelligent, introspective girl who found her escape in books, films, and the vast, dark landscapes of her own imagination. She felt like a foreigner in her own home, an artist trapped in a world of prose. Then she met Juliet Hume. Juliet, also 15, was everything Pauline was not. She was blonde, ethereal, and radiated an aura of sophisticated, upper-class English grace. Her father, Dr. Henry Hume, was the rector of the University of Canterbury, a distinguished physicist who had worked on the British atomic bomb project. The Holmes lived in a grand home in the affluent Ilam suburbs, a place of intellectual conversation and worldly experience. But Juliet, like Pauline, was an outcast. A childhood diagnosis of tuberculosis had sent her bouncing between sanatoriums and different countries, separating her from her parents for long stretches and leaving her with a lingering sense of fragility and isolation. She was academically brilliant but socially adrift, her sharp intellect and vivid imagination setting her apart from her peers. Their meeting at Christchurch Girls' High School in 1952 was a moment of mutual recognition, a collision of two lonely, brilliant minds. They found in each other what they lacked in the world around them, a reflection of their own intensity. Their friendship blossomed with a speed and ferocity that was unsettling to those around them. They were inseparable, spending every possible moment together, their conversations a torrent of shared ideas and private jokes. They saw themselves not as mere friends, but as soulmates, two halves of a single, extraordinary entity. This bond quickly evolved beyond simple friendship. It became the foundation for a shared paracosm, an intensely detailed, collaboratively built fantasy world. They called it the Fourth World. It was their secret kingdom, a heaven-like dimension accessible only to them, populated by a royal court of characters they had invented, modeled on the glamorous film stars they idolized, like James Mason and Orson Welles. They wrote epic novels about the adventures of these characters. They sculpted them out of clay. They acted out their dramas in the secluded hills above Christchurch. The Fourth World was not a game. It was a parallel reality, a place with its own history, its own moral code, and its own religion. It was, in their minds, infinitely more real and more important than the drab, restrictive world of 1950s Christchurch. In this world, they shed their given names. Pauline became Gina, and Juliet became Deborah. Their identities began to merge, their thoughts and emotions becoming indistinguishable. This psychological fusion was meticulously, almost obsessively, documented by Pauline in a series of diaries. Her entries, written with a chillingly precocious self-awareness, chronicle the deepening of their bond and their growing contempt for the outside world. She wrote of their shared sicknesses, moments of ecstatic, almost spiritual connection. She detailed their shared belief that they were geniuses, artistic prodigies whose special bond set them above ordinary mortals. Their parents watched this consuming friendship with growing concern. The Parkers saw Juliet as a snobbish influence, filling their daughter's head with grandiose ideas. The Holmes, more liberal but emotionally distant, viewed Pauline as a somber, overly intense companion for their fragile daughter. Both families tried to impose limits, to create distance between the girls. But every attempt to separate them was met with hysterical opposition and only served to reinforce the girls' shared delusion. In their minds, their parents were not concerned caregivers. They were enemies, ignorant lesser mortals, who were conspiring to destroy the sacred bond that defined their existence. The shared psychosis was now fully formed. Juliet, with her charismatic and dominant personality, was the primary architect of the fantasy. Pauline, with her desperate need for belonging and her dark, obsessive nature, was the devoted acolyte. Together, they had constructed a fortress of delusion. Anyone who threatened it was not just an inconvenience, they were a mortal enemy. And the person they came to see as the greatest threat of all was Pauline's mother, Honora. In Pauline's diaries, Honora is portrayed as the embodiment of everything the girls despised. She was common, unimaginative, and deeply disapproving of their relationship. Pauline's entries about her mother drip with a cold, escalating hatred. She refers to her as the obstacle. As the girls' fantasy world grew more elaborate, Honora's simple, pragmatic presence became an intolerable intrusion. The crisis came in the winter of 1954. The Hume family, which had appeared so stable and perfect from the outside, imploded. Dr. Hume was forced to resign from his position as rector amid a scandal involving his wife's affair with one of the boarders the Parkers had taken in. The family was disintegrating. The decision was made that Dr. Hume would take a new post in South Africa, and Juliet would be sent to live with relatives there. For Pauline and Juliet, this was not just a sad farewell. It was an apocalypse. The thought of separation was unbearable, an existential threat to the fourth world and to their very identities. They devised a plan. Pauline must go with Juliet to South Africa. But they knew, with absolute certainty, that Honora would never permit it. She would never allow her daughter to move across the world with the Holmes. Therefore, in their twisted but internally consistent logic, the obstacle had to be removed. The idea of murdering Honora Parker was not born from a sudden, passionate rage. It was a coolly considered, practical solution to a logistical problem. Pauline's diary entries from this period are terrifying in their calm, methodical planning. She writes about the decision to commit the murder with the same tone she uses to describe a new chapter in one of their novels. They discuss methods, locations, and alibis. The act of matricide was being scripted like a scene from one of their fantasies. The date was set for June 22, 1954. The plan was meticulously arranged. Pauline and Juliet would take Honora for a walk in Victoria Park, a sprawling, wooded area on the Port Hills. They chose a secluded, tree-lined path. The weapon was a half-brick, which they placed inside an old stocking for a better grip. The pretense was a final, pleasant outing before Juliet's departure, a last chance for Honora to see the pretty stones at a small cafe in the park. That afternoon, the three of them took a bus to the park. Honora, likely believing she was participating in a farewell ritual for her daughter's troubled friend, was oblivious to the plot. They walked along the path, the two girls chatting with a forced cheerfulness. When they reached the designated spot, far from any potential witnesses, the plan was put into action. As Honora bent down to look at a small, pink stone that Juliet had placed on the ground as a marker, Pauline brought the brick-filled stocking down on the back of her head. The first blow was not fatal. A struggle ensued. What followed was a frenzy of violence. The two girls, acting in concert, struck Honora again and again, their attack fueled by a shared, hysterical rage. They hit her over 40 times, bludgeoning her face and head until she was unrecognizable. The scene, when discovered, would be one of savage overkill, the ground soaked in blood. Their act complete, the girls ran, covered in blood, to the small tea kiosk they had passed earlier. They burst in, screaming and hysterical, telling the owner a fabricated story. They claimed that Pauline's mother had slipped on the wet path, fallen, and hit her head on a rock. It was a performance, but a clumsy one. The story immediately unraveled when the police arrived and saw the body. The sheer, brutal violence of the injuries was utterly inconsistent with a simple fall. The investigation was swift. The police searched the Parker home and found Pauline's diaries. The small, locked books contain the entire story, the obsessive friendship, the fantasy world, the escalating hatred for Honora, and the cold-blooded, detailed plan for her murder. The diaries were the voice of the folie à deux, a confession written before the crime was even committed. The trial of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume captivated New Zealand and made headlines around the world. The press dubbed them the Deadly Darlings. The defense argued that the girls were not evil, but insane, suffering from a communicable madness. Their lawyers presented the diagnosis of folie à deux, arguing that their shared fantasy world had completely supplanted their ability to distinguish right from wrong. They read excerpts from Pauline's diaries in court, revealing the depth of their delusion to a shocked public. The prosecution argued that they were sane, cunning, and fully aware of the nature of their crime. They were, the Crown argued, incurably wicked. The jury agreed with the prosecution. They rejected the insanity defense and found both girls guilty of murder. Because they were too young for the death penalty, they were sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, to be released when they were no longer deemed a threat. A critical, unwritten condition of their eventual release was that they must never, under any circumstances, contact each other again. The cure for their shared madness was permanent separation. They each served about 5 years in prison. Upon their release, they were given new identities and they vanished, fading back into the world that had once seemed so alien to them. For decades, their whereabouts were a mystery. Then, in the 1990s, around the time Peter Jackson's film about their case, Heavenly Creatures, was released, their new identities were discovered by journalists. Pauline Parker had become Hilary Nathan. She was living a quiet, reclusive life in a small village in Kent, England, running a children's riding school. She had become a devout Roman Catholic, her life dedicated to piety and penance. The revelation about Juliet Hume was even more startling. She had become Anne Perry, one of the world's most successful and prolific writers of historical crime fiction. The girl who had co-authored a murder had become a celebrated author of murder mysteries, her books selling in the millions. She lived in a remote part of Scotland, her past a closely guarded secret until it was exposed. The story of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume is a haunting exploration of the power of a shared reality. It demonstrates how two individuals, through intense emotional and psychological fusion, can construct a world so compelling that it can sanction the ultimate crime. Separated, they were able to re-enter society and live unremarkable, law-abiding lives. But together, they were something else. They were heavenly creatures, inhabitants of a fourth world where the only law was their own desire, and where a mother's life was a small price to pay for the preservation of paradise. Case 3. The Moors Murders Sadistic Pact. The story of the Moors murders is not one of a sudden, explosive psychosis. It is a slow-burning fire, a deliberate and methodical descent into a shared philosophy of evil. Its backdrop is not a frantic mind, but the bleak, post-industrial landscape of Manchester in the early 1960s. It was a world of gray skies, soot-stained brick, and a pervasive sense of social constraint. And it was in this world that two unremarkable people would forge a pact so depraved it would permanently alter Britain's perception of human nature. Myra Hindley was a 20-year-old typist at Millward's Merchandising, a wholesale chemical distributor. To her colleagues, she was a platinum blonde with a sharp sense of style, a bit aloof, but otherwise unremarkable. She was a woman from a tough, working-class background, her personality shaped by a volatile home life and a deep, unfulfilled longing for something more than the predictable cycle of work, dance halls, and eventual marriage. She was a canvas, waiting for an artist. The artist arrived in the form of Ian Brady. A stock clerk at the same firm, Brady was a stark contrast to the world around him. He was a brooding, solitary Scotsman of 23, his dark hair and intense, cold eyes setting him apart. He was an intellectual snob, contemptuous of his colleagues and the mundane world they inhabited. His mind was a landscape of dark, borrowed ideologies. He was obsessed with Nazi Germany, not for its politics, but for its aesthetics of power and its perceived triumph of the will. He immersed himself in the writings of the Marquis de Sade and Friedrich Nietzsche, twisting their complex philosophies into a simple, self-serving doctrine that superior beings, like himself, were above the petty morality of the herd. He believed that the ultimate expression of this superiority was the commission of the perfect murder, an act of pure will, untainted by motive or remorse. When Myra Hindley first laid eyes on Ian Brady, she was not repulsed by his strangeness. She was captivated by it. She saw in him the escape she craved. He was different, dangerous, and intelligent. She developed an intense, almost worshipful infatuation. For over a year, she pursued him, altering her appearance to match his tastes, dyeing her hair a starker blonde, adopting a more severe style. Brady, in turn, saw in her not a partner, but a potential acolyte. He saw pliable clay that he could mold into his own image. Their relationship, when it finally began, was not a romance. It was an indoctrination. Brady became her tutor, her guru. He gave her books to read, treatises on philosophy and Asada's catalogues of cruelty. He lectured her on his nihilistic worldview, systematically dismantling her conventional morality and replacing it with his own. He was not just corrupting her, he was converting her. This was the genesis of their folie à deux. It was not a shared delusion about external persecutors, but a shared internal belief in their own godhood. Brady was the primary, the charismatic psychopath who created the belief system. Myra was the secondary, the devoted follower who absorbed his philosophy so completely that it became her own. Their pact was sealed not with a kiss, but with a camera. They began to take photographs of each other posing with weapons, Myra with a pistol, affecting the cold stare of a gangster's maul. These were not playful snapshots. They were rehearsals. They were creating their new identities as transgressors, as people who lived outside the law. They committed petty crimes, robbing a business for a small sum of money. These were tests of loyalty, stepping stones on the path to the ultimate crime that Brady preached. Myra passed every test. Her devotion to Brady was absolute. His will was her will. By the summer of 1963, the indoctrination was complete. They were no longer Ian and Myra, two lonely workers from Manchester. They were a single entity, a two-person cult dedicated to the worship of their own power. The time had come to perform their first sacrament, murder. Their chosen hunting ground was the desolate, windswept expanse of Saddleworth Moor, a vast peat bog that stretched between Manchester and Yorkshire. The moor, with its bleak, empty beauty, became the third character in their drama. It was their cathedral, a place vast enough to hold their secrets and indifferent enough to witness their crimes without judgment. Their first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed. She was a neighbor of Myra's sister. On the evening of July 12, 1963, Myra Hindley played the role she would perfect over the next 2 years. She became the lure. Driving her new minivan, a symbol of modest, working-class respectability, she offered Pauline a lift to a local dance hall. Pauline, knowing Myra, trusted her and got into the van. But they did not go to the dance hall. Myra drove to the moors, where Ian Brady was waiting. There, Pauline was assaulted and murdered. They buried her body in a shallow grave in the peat, the dark earth swallowing her whole. They returned home, their pact now consecrated in blood. The murder of Pauline Reed solidified their shared reality. It had worked. They had transcended morality and gotten away with it. This success emboldened them, and a chilling pattern was established. They would target children, the most vulnerable members of the herd. Myra, with her non-threatening female presence and her car, was the perfect bait. 4 months later, in November 1963, they abducted 12-year-old John Kilbride from a market in Ashton-under-Lyne. Again, Myra was the lure. They took him to the moors, murdered him, and buried him. They took photographs of the landscape, with Myra posing near the burial site, grim souvenirs of their conquest. For nearly a year, they were dormant. Then, in June 1964, they took 12-year-old Keith Bennett. Keith was on his way to his grandmother's house when he was approached by Myra and Brady. They murdered him and buried him on the moor. His body would become their most enduring, cruel secret. Their depravity reached its apex on Boxing Day, December 26, 1964. They abducted 10-year-old Leslie and Downey from a fairground. This time, they did not go straight to the moors. They took her back to their small council house at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue, which had become their laboratory of evil. There, they subjected her to a horrific ordeal, forcing her to pose for pornographic photographs before assaulting and murdering her. And in a final, chilling act of hubris, Ian Brady recorded the last 17 minutes of her life on a small reel-to-reel tape recorder. The tape captured her desperate pleas, her terror, and her final, fading cries. It was the ultimate trophy, a document of their absolute power over another human life. They then took her body to the moors and buried her near the grave of John Kilbride. By 1965, their shared world was absolute. They were gods, moving invisibly among mortals, their terrible secrets hidden beneath the heather of Saddleworth Moor. But their arrogance would be their undoing. On the night of October 6, 1965, they committed their final, fatal error. They murdered 17-year-old Edward Evans, a young man Brady had picked up at a train station. Unlike the others, this murder was not meticulously planned. It was impulsive, messy, and committed in their living room with an axe. And, crucially, there was a witness. The witness was David Smith, Myra Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law. Brady, in his supreme arrogance, had invited Smith over to watch, perhaps hoping to recruit a new disciple. But Smith was not a potential convert. He was a normal teenager. He watched in abject terror as Brady and Hindley murdered Evans. He was forced to help them clean up some of the blood before he was allowed to leave. Smith ran home to his wife, Myra's sister Maureen, and, in a state of shock, told her everything he had seen. A few hours later, he made a phone call that would shatter the private world of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley forever. He called the police. When police arrived at Wardlebrook Avenue, they found Edward Evans's body in an upstairs room. Brady was arrested, his response a cool, arrogant defiance. Myra was initially treated as a witness, but her cold demeanor and inconsistent statements quickly made her a suspect. The key that unlocked the full scope of their crimes was found in a luggage locker at a train station. It contained the pornographic photos of Leslie and Downey and, most damningly, the audio tape of her murder. The discovery of the tape led to a massive police search on Saddleworth Moor. They found the bodies of Leslie and Downey and John Kilbride. Brady and Hindley were charged with their murders, as well as the murder of Edward Evans. At their trial in 1966, they were a spectacle of unrepentant evil. They showed no remorse, their expressions a mixture of contempt and indifference. The tape of Leslie and Downey was played to a silent, horrified courtroom. They were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. They were separated, the standard protocol for breaking a folie à deux. In prison, Ian Brady remained the unrepentant nihilist, spending his decades playing mind games with police and the families of his victims, refusing to give up the location of Keith Bennett's grave. He died in a secure hospital in 2017, taking his secret with him. Myra Hindley's path was more complex. For years, she maintained her devotion to Brady. But then she began a long, public campaign for her release, claiming that she had been a victim, a young woman brainwashed and controlled by a sadistic monster. She renounced Brady, converted to Roman Catholicism, and presented herself as a reformed, penitent woman. Her plea divided Britain. Was she truly reformed? Or was this just another performance, another manipulation? The public and the courts never believed her. She died in prison in 2002. It was only in 1985, 2 decades after their conviction, that they finally confessed to the murders of Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett, leading police on another grim and largely fruitless search of the moors. Pauline's body was eventually found. Keith's never was. The Moors murders remain a singular stain on the British consciousness. It was a case of folie à deux that went beyond shared delusion into a shared, willed commitment to evil. Ian Brady created a philosophy, and Myra Hindley became its most zealous follower. Together, they turned a bleak patch of English moorland into a graveyard, a private monument to their own depravity. The search for Keith Bennett's body continues, a haunting, decades-long epilogue to their sadistic pact, and a final, silent proof that the evil they created together outlived them both. Of course. Here is the 4th case. Case 4. The Erickson Twins' Motorway Madness. Some events defy rational explanation. They erupt into the mundane world with such surreal, chaotic force that they seem to belong to a different plane of reality. They leave investigators, witnesses, and the public grasping for a framework, a logic that simply isn't there. The story of Ursula and Sabina Erickson is one such event. It is a story that begins in confusion, escalates into unbelievable violence, and culminates in a senseless murder, all captured, in part, by the unblinking eye of a television camera. It is perhaps the most bizarre and starkly public demonstration of folie à deux ever recorded. The stage for this tragedy was the M6 motorway in central England, one of the country's busiest and most vital arteries. On a Saturday afternoon in May of 2008, Drivers traveling through the county of Staffordshire would have been focused on the usual things: the traffic, the destination, the passage of time. They could not have known they were about to become unwilling spectators to the complete disintegration of two human minds. The minds in question belonged to Ursula and Sabina Eriksson, identical twins from Sweden. In their 40s, they had lived relatively separate, unremarkable adult lives. Ursula resided in the United States, while Sabina had settled in County Cork, Ireland, with her partner and 2 children. There was nothing in their history to suggest a predisposition for violence or severe mental illness. They were simply 2 sisters, bound by the unique, often inexplicable closeness that twins share. The prelude to the madness began quietly. Sabina, without any clear explanation, traveled from her home in Ireland to visit Ursula in London. Shortly after her arrival, the 2 sisters boarded a National Express coach bound for Liverpool. Their behavior on the bus was the first sign that something was deeply wrong. They appeared agitated, paranoid. They clutched their handbags tightly, refusing to let them be stowed in the luggage compartment. They complained to the driver that they felt unwell, but their agitation grew. They became so disruptive, their anxieties so palpable, that the driver eventually asked them to leave at the next available stop, a service station on the M6. Now stranded, their paranoia intensified. At the service station, they spoke to the manager, their words a torrent of bizarre, fearful claims. They said they were being followed. They insisted that their children, who were safe in Ireland, had been taken from Sabina and were at risk of having their organs harvested. This specific, persecutory delusion would become the thematic core of their shared psychosis. They were 2 women adrift, not just physically on the side of a motorway, but psychologically, in a sea of terror only they could perceive. They left the service station and did the unthinkable. They began to walk along the narrow central reservation of the M6, the thin strip of land separating roaring lanes of high-speed traffic. They were a bizarre, vulnerable spectacle. It was at this point that their private crisis became a public emergency. A crew from the television show Motorway Cops was filming with the Central Motorway Police Group that day, and they, along with Highways Agency officers, were dispatched to the scene. The footage they captured is profoundly unsettling. The police approached the twins with caution and concern. The sisters, for their part, appear eerily calm one moment, then suddenly panicked the next. Sabina, smoking a cigarette, tells an officer, "I know you're not real." They seem detached, disconnected from the very real danger of their situation. The officers try to coax them towards the safety of the hard shoulder, but the twins are operating under a different set of rules. Suddenly, without warning, Ursula breaks free. She makes a deliberate dash into the northbound lane, directly into the path of an oncoming articulated lorry. The impact is horrific. The truck, unable to stop, slams into her, its massive wheels running over her legs. She is thrown across the tarmac, her body a broken, mangled heap. It is a scene of certain death. The police and paramedics rush to Ursula's side, a sense of grim duty on their faces. Sabina, her twin, watches. There is no hysteria, no outburst of grief. Her expression is one of blank, eerie calm. Then, as her sister is being attended to, she follows suit. She vaults over the central barrier and runs headlong into the traffic on the other side. A red Volkswagen Polo strikes her at an estimated 55 miles per hour. The impact catapults her into the air. She lands in a crumpled heap on the road, unconscious. The scene is now one of absolute carnage and disbelief. 2 women, twin sisters, have, in a matter of minutes, thrown themselves under heavy, fast-moving vehicles. But the most surreal part of the story was yet to come. Against all odds, both sisters were alive. Ursula was grievously injured, her legs crushed, but she survived. And Sabina, after being struck by a car and knocked unconscious, began to stir. What happened next defied all medical and logical explanation. Sabina came to, and with a surge of adrenaline and psychosis, she got to her feet. She did not act like someone who had just survived a life-threatening impact. She became violent. She lashed out at the police officers who were trying to help her, punching one in the face. She screamed, "They're going to steal my organs," as paramedics tried to restrain her. She displayed a strength that seemed almost superhuman, fighting off several people before she could be subdued and loaded into an ambulance. Her delusion was now in full, violent bloom, raw and exposed on the tarmac of the M6. Sabina was taken to the hospital. Yet, in what would prove to be a catastrophic failure of medical and psychiatric assessment, she was discharged after just 5 hours. The doctors found no major internal injuries and, astonishingly, she was deemed sane, enough to be released into police custody to await questioning. The system, faced with an event so far outside its normal parameters, had defaulted to a conclusion that was tragically, fatally wrong. The next day, Sabina was released from police custody without a full psychiatric evaluation. She began wandering the streets of Fenton, a district of Stoke-on-Trent, disoriented and still in the grip of her delusion. It was here that her path crossed with that of Glenn Hollinshead. Hollinshead, a 54-year-old self-employed welder and a former RAF paramedic, was walking his dog with a friend. He saw Sabina, looking lost and distressed. He was a kind man, a man whose instinct was to help. He approached her, asked if she needed assistance, and, taking pity on her, offered her a place to stay for the night. It was an act of pure, selfless compassion. It was also a death sentence. At Hollinshead's home, Sabina's behavior was erratic, but not overtly threatening. She thanked him for his kindness. She explained that she was looking for her sister, a story that was, in a fractured way, true. She seemed to be calming down. Glenn Hollinshead likely believed he was helping a woman in the midst of a personal crisis, a woman who had simply had a very bad day. The following evening, the delusion returned with lethal force. Sabina's paranoia spiked. She was watching the two men, Hollinshead and his friend, with suspicion. She offered them cigarettes but would snatch them away before they could take one. Her behavior grew increasingly strange. Then, in a sudden, unprovoked explosion of violence, she grabbed a steak knife from the kitchen. She lunged at Glenn Hollinshead and stabbed him 5 times. Mortally wounded, Hollinshead staggered out of his front door. He collapsed on the pavement outside, gasping to a neighbor, "She stabbed me," before he died. Sabina fled the house. She ran into the street, grabbing a hammer from the toolbox in Hollinshead's yard. As she ran, she began to beat herself over the head with the hammer. A passing motorist, seeing the commotion, stopped his car and tried to intervene. Sabina turned on him, striking him in the head with the hammer before continuing her flight. The police, alerted by neighbors, cornered her on a bridge over a dual carriageway. Trapped, Sabina made one final, desperate attempt to escape her perceived persecutors. She climbed onto the railing and leaped 40 feet to the busy road below. The fall broke her ankle and fractured her skull. And yet, once again, she survived. Sabina Eriksson's trial was as perplexing as her crimes. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The prosecution, having consulted with psychiatrists, accepted the plea. The court was presented with the rare and confounding diagnosis of folie à deux. The theory put forward was that one twin, likely Ursula, had suffered an initial psychotic break. Sabina, due to the intense, codependent nature of their relationship, had absorbed and mirrored her sister's delusion. Their isolation on the bus and at the service station had created a psychological echo chamber, amplifying their shared paranoia until it consumed them. When Ursula was hit by the lorry, the psychological link was violently severed, causing Sabina's own psychosis to erupt with catastrophic force, untethered from its source. The judge sentenced Sabina to 5 years in prison, a sentence that sparked public outrage. To many, it seemed incomprehensibly lenient for a woman who had committed a brutal, unprovoked murder. The case laid bare the deep chasm between the legal definition of madness and the public's understanding of evil. Sabina was released from prison in 2011. Ursula recovered from her devastating injuries. The sisters, upon Sabina's release, were reportedly reunited. They have since vanished from the public eye, their story relegated to the annals of true crime and psychological curiosities. The ultimate cause, the initial spark that ignited their shared madness, remains unknown. The story of the Erickson twins is a chilling testament to the terrifying fragility of the human mind. It is a perfect storm of a rare psychiatric condition, a catastrophic failure of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable, and the fatal kindness of a good Samaritan. Glenn Hollinshead was not killed by an evil woman. He was killed by a sickness, a shared madness that came roaring down a motorway and ended in his quiet suburban home. His death is a profound and tragic reminder that sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that are entirely invisible, raging behind the eyes of a stranger. Case 5. The Slender Man's Child Proxies. Our final story does not take place in a dusty, forgotten past or a bleak, industrial city. It takes place in the seemingly idyllic suburban landscape of Waukesha, Wisconsin in 2014. It is a story born not of class struggle or philosophical evil, but from the glowing screens of the digital age. It is a case that demonstrates how a modern myth, a ghost in the machine, can infect the minds of the vulnerable and create a folie à deux so powerful it demands a blood sacrifice. The story revolves around 3 12-year-old girls, Anissa Weier, Morgan Geyser, and Peyton Lutner. To the outside world, they were a typical trio of middle school friends. They had sleepovers, shared secrets, and navigated the awkward, confusing terrain of early adolescence together. Peyton, known to her friends as Bella, was the social, stable center of the group. Anissa was quiet and seeking acceptance. Morgan was creative, quirky, and deeply imaginative. They were, in many ways, unremarkable. But beneath this surface of childhood normalcy, a dark and powerful narrative was taking hold in the shared world of 2 of the girls. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were lonely children. They found solace not just in their friendship with each other, but in the vast, collaborative world of online horror fiction known as creepypasta. It was here they discovered him. The Slender Man was not an ancient legend or a figure from folklore. He was a crowdsourced creation, born on an internet forum in 2009. He was a tall, faceless figure in a black suit, with unnaturally long limbs, sometimes depicted with tentacles emerging from his back. He was a digital boogeyman, a blank slate onto which a generation of internet users projected their fears. He was known to stalk, abduct, and traumatize his victims, particularly children. He was, by design, pure fiction. But for Morgan and Anissa, he became real. Their fascination with the stories evolved into a genuine, unshakable belief. In the isolated world of their friendship, they began to construct a shared delusional reality with Slender Man at its center. He was no longer a character in a story. He was a powerful entity who was watching them, communicating with them, and making demands of them. The dynamic of their folie à deux was later clarified by psychiatric evaluations. Morgan Geyser, who was later diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia, was the primary partner. She was the one who likely experienced the initial psychotic break, the one for whom Slender Man was a tangible, threatening presence. She believed he could read her mind and would harm her family if she disobeyed him. Anissa Weier, the secondary partner, was drawn into this delusion through her intense desire for friendship and belonging. She absorbed Morgan's belief system so completely that it became her own reality. She did not just humor her friend, she believed with her. Together, they convinced each other that they were in grave danger. The only way to appease the Slender Man, to prove their loyalty and become his proxies, was to commit a murder in his name. This act, they believed, would grant them passage to his mansion, which they imagined was located in Wisconsin's Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. There, they would be safe and live with him forever. The act of killing was not, in their minds, an act of malice. It was an act of survival, a terrible but necessary rite of passage into a new, magical life. Every story needs a victim. In a decision of profound and heartbreaking cruelty, they chose their best friend, Peyton Lutner. She was not an enemy. She was not a bully. She was chosen for a single, terrible reason. She was close. She was the friend who trusted them implicitly, making her the easiest target. The plan was discussed for months, a chillingly premeditated plot conceived by 12-year-old minds. The initial plan was to murder Peyton during a sleepover at Morgan's house for her 12th birthday. They would stab her in her sleep. But when the moment came, they couldn't go through with it. Anissa would later say they were too tired. It was a child's excuse for a monstrous hesitation. The plan was postponed, not abandoned. The next morning, May 31st, 2014, the three girls went to a nearby park. They played a game of hide-and-seek in a wooded area. This was the new, agreed-upon setting for the sacrifice. Morgan had a kitchen knife hidden in her waistband. As they walked deeper into the woods, the moment arrived. According to their later testimony, Anissa pushed Peyton to the ground and told Morgan, "Do it. Go ballistic." Morgan hesitated. She later told police she felt a moment of empathy for her friend. But Anissa continued to push her, reminding her of their duty to Slender Man. And so, Morgan Geyser, a 12-year-old girl in the grip of a shared madness, lunged forward. She stabbed her best friend, Peyton Lutner, 19 times in the chest, arms, and legs. Some of the wounds struck major organs, narrowly missing her heart by a millimeter. Believing Peyton was dead or dying, they committed one final, chilling act. Morgan, seeing her friend gasping on the ground, reportedly told her to lie still, that they would get help. It was a lie. Anissa and Morgan turned and walked away, leaving Peyton for dead in the woods. Their task was complete. They had made their offering to Slender Man. They began their long walk towards the national forest, towards his mythical mansion, convinced their new life was about to begin. But Peyton Lutner did not die. In an act of incredible will and resilience, she forced herself to her feet. She held her own wounds closed and dragged herself out of the woods and onto a nearby path. She was discovered by a cyclist who immediately called 911. Peyton, despite her horrific injuries, was able to give the names of her attackers to the police. Anissa and Morgan were found hours later, walking along an interstate highway, miles from the park. They were not running or hiding. They were on a pilgrimage. When the police apprehended them, they were calm and compliant. The knife was in Morgan's bag. In their police interviews, the full, bizarre truth came out. They did not deny what they had done. Instead, they calmly and rationally, from their perspective, explained why they had done it. They told the officers about Slender Man, about his threats to their families, about their need to become his proxies. They were not confessing to a crime. They were explaining a necessity. The folie à deux was laid bare in the sterile light of an interrogation room. The case presented a profound legal and ethical dilemma. Should these two children be treated as cold-blooded killers or as victims of a severe, shared mental illness? They were initially charged as adults due to the severity of the crime. The legal battle that followed centered on their mental states. Ultimately, the court system acknowledged the role of their shared psychosis. Anissa Weier pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and, after being found not criminally responsible due to mental disease, was sentenced to up to 25 years in a state mental health facility. Morgan Geyser, who accepted a plea deal, was also found not guilty by reason of mental defect and sentenced to up to 40 years in a mental institution. The story of the Slender Man stabbing is a uniquely modern horror story. The monster was not a person, but an idea. The madness was not born in a vacuum, but cultivated in the fertile ground of the internet and nurtured in the hothouse environment of an intense, codependent friendship. It is a case that forces us to confront the power of the narratives we create online and their potential to infect vulnerable minds. Peyton Lutner survived her ordeal, a living testament to resilience in the face of an unimaginable betrayal. But her life, along with the lives of the two girls who tried to kill her, was irrevocably fractured. They are all victims of a boogeyman who is conjured out of pixels and code, a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous shared delusions are the ones that convince us that our nightmares are real. A shared madness is a terrifying alchemy. It takes the loyalty of sisterhood, the intensity of friendship, the devotion of love, and transmutes it into a poison. In each of these cases, a private world, built for two, became a fortress against reality, and violence became the only way to defend it. Whether driven by oppression, fantasy, philosophy, or fear, the result was the same, a conspiracy of the mind that ended in bloodshed. These stories serve as a profound and disturbing reminder that when a single mind breaks, it is a tragedy. But when that madness finds a willing partner, it can become a catastrophe. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and stay safe.